All right, everyone, let's see if we can get started. They gave me a gavel, which I prefer not to use. So why don't we just move ahead? I'm going to use it. Okay, so welcome back to panel 2 of what I think will be 5 panels total over the next 2 days. The second panel today is going to focus on virtual currency and regulatory issues. It's probably a little less sexy than our first panel, but at least some of the lawyers up here on the panel still find it quite sexy. And in any event, very, very important. And it's easy to say we're going to come up with a new scheme for regulating virtual currency and Bitcoin. It's quite another thing to actually do it, and to do it smart, and to do it within the letter of the law, and to come up with a scheme that works from a regulatory perspective and from an industry perspective. So we have a fantastic panel, and I want to thank each of you for being here. You're experts in each of your fields. So from the left, first, I'd like to introduce Carol Van Clif, who is a partner at the law firm of Patton Boggs. Next to her left, is Charles Lee, the creator of Litecoin, which is another virtual currency as opposed to Bitcoin. And to my far right is Judy Renierson, a partner at the law firm of Brian Cave. So we very much look forward to hearing from all of you. Let me go through the formality of swearing you in. If each of you will rise and raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the whole truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Yes. Thank you. So why don't we start with Mr. Lee? You want to make the first opening statement? And thank you again for being here. You want to have that green light on, or they're going to yell at you.
Superintendent Losky and members of the staff, thank you for inviting me here. My name is Charles Lee. I hold a bachelor's and master's degree in computer science and electrical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I'm currently employed as a software engineer at Coinbase, which is a Bitcoin company. I'm also the creator of Litecoin. Litecoin is the second most popular cryptocurrency behind Bitcoin. It is sometimes referred to as silver to Bitcoin's gold. Litecoin is very similar to Bitcoin as it is a modified version of the open source code used in Bitcoin. There are currently 25 million total Litecoins in existence, with each Litecoin being worth about $21 today. This means that the Litecoin total value is a little bit over $500 million today. As we all know, Bitcoin was created by a mysterious person or a group of people named Satoshi Nakamoto. Unfortunately, I did not get a chance to meet Mr. Nakamoto before he disappeared in late 2010. So I cannot possibly represent his point of view on this topic today. But having created the second most popular cryptocurrency and lived through the ups and downs of the cryptocurrency revolution the past 2.5 years, I might have some insights into this evolving landscape that may be useful to you. And I'll try my best to answer all of your questions. I understand that whatever decisions that come out of this hearing today will affect both Bitcoin, Litecoin, and every other cryptocurrencies. As you may have noticed, I refer to both Bitcoin and Litecoin as cryptocurrency instead of virtual currency. Cryptocurrency is a separate class of virtual currencies. Before the creation of Bitcoin, virtual currencies existed, and they included such things as the World of Warcraft gold or Linden dollars. These are virtual because there's no physical form. The difference between these virtual currencies and cryptocurrencies is that before the creation of Bitcoin, all virtual currencies were centralized. Linden Labs has a database of all their users and how much each of them own. If any of these users were trying to launder money with the Linden dollars that they own, it would be very easy to track down these users and find out who the culprit is, because all you have to do is just talk to Linden Labs and ask them for that information. Bitcoin brought about the invention of decentralized currency, which is based on cryptography. And with this amazing invention comes the ability for bad actors to try to cover their tracks. I think this is analogous to what happened with the invention of the internet. The internet brought about decentralized information. With that, we no longer have to rely on getting information only from major media companies. For better or worse, we now get information from blogs, from Twitter, from Facebook, from Wikipedia, and even from WikiLeaks. This happened because the internet was not overly regulated. Imagine if, in order to put up a blog, you had to apply for a cumbersome internet license. If that were the case, internet would not have become such a tremendously positive influence to everyone's life today. So, although regulation is needed, I urge you to not regulate cryptocurrency too much as to stifle innovation in this evolving cryptocurrency landscape. Thank you.
I don't have my light on. Ms. Van Cleef, why don't we turn it over to you for your opening statement?
Thank you. My name is Carol Van Cleef. I'm an attorney who advises both traditional money transmitters and emerging payment companies, including those involved with digital and virtual currencies, on both state money transmitting licensing issues, anti-money laundering compliance, and consumer protection and disclosure issues. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today before the department and commend Superintendent Lasky and his staff on this important initiative to address appropriate regulatory guidelines for digital and virtual currencies. I will discuss today a different type of digital currency that offers important contrast to Bitcoin and other decentralized digital currencies that Mr. Lee just discussed. Excuse me. My apologies, I pushed the wrong button here. Well, you know, I'm starting to wonder that. Here we go. Okay. Upon receipt of necessary regulatory approvals, a company called Coeptus or Septus, depending upon the Latin variation of pronunciation that you choose, is preparing to launch the global standard system with a digital currency that will circulate electronically on a closed settlement platform and be 100% backed by physical gold. The rules governing the system will provide for freedom from default, and the gold reserve will serve to fully protect the account holder's value. The system is centralized and closed. It has an administrator that is responsible for issuing and redeeming currency. No value can directly enter or leave the system. The value created in the system stays within the system. The currency can only be obtained from someone who has it, either a person-to-person transfer or from an exchange provider. Based on legal precedent, which was confirmed in part by FinCEN's March 2013 guidance, Coeptus understands that the global standard system is subject to registration with FinCEN as a money service business and to state money transmitter licensing requirements. Based on the same legal principles and the FinCEN guidance, exchange providers for the global standard currency are also transmitters, and the company will require all exchangers to be appropriately regulated financial institutions. The company understands its obligations as well under both the Bank Secrecy Act and the federal criminal statutes, and has developed comprehensive AML, anti-money laundering, and OFAC compliance programs, which it believes equal or exceed that of most traditional money service businesses and compare favorably to the most robust in the banking system. The system will afford account holders with privacy and security, but not anonymity. Account holders will be subject to bank-like CIP and further due diligence, but they will not have to share their personal financial information with merchants in using the system. Payments will settle immediately. The system carefully balances non-repudiation with payer protection. Payments are final with no chargebacks or default. However, should a claim be made that a transaction is erroneous or unauthorized, a sophisticated, legally largely automated dispute mechanism will provide for rapid response and mitigation. Sophisticated account protections have also been put into place to reduce the opportunity to compromise accounts and to mitigate any resulting damage or loss to the account holder should a compromise occur. The centralized administrator is able to respond to and support lawful requests for information. The choice of gold as a reserve to back the currency is based on the long-standing acceptance of gold as a store of value, its liquidity, market infrastructure, and its acceptance for traditional financial institutions as a reserve for traditional financial institutions and governments. Important, it is accorded the same risk weighting as cash under federal bank capital requirements. Transaction costs are not zero, quite honestly, compliance cost, but they are low, ranging from 1% for a $70 transaction and decreasing as the transaction value rises. For example, 0.1% at a level of a $5,000 transaction. Concerns raised about the ability of alternative currency systems to effectively understand, report, and pay taxes are alleviated by the system's ability to capture and provide reports in the sovereign currency necessary for tax obligations. In summary, the global standard system is designed to offer low-cost payments with less friction and greater security and assurance in a manner fully consistent with important national priorities to protect consumers and to prevent use and abuse of the system for money laundering and terrorist financing purposes. I am encouraged by the efforts of the DFS to consider ways to accommodate the inevitable innovation in this area. However, time is of the essence as this technology is rapidly evolving. Innovation will adapt to new regulation, but it won't wait for regulation. It is and will shift to other jurisdictions, taking jobs and the resulting wealth with it. The true losers will be U.S. residents. I welcome your questions.
Well, thank you very much. That was very interesting. And I should have said at the top when we introduced this panel, this is not purely a panel about regulation. It's also a panel about alternatives to Bitcoin in the virtual currency world. And our first two presenters primarily spoke about that, so I didn't want there to be confusion. But with that said, I wanted to also turn it over to Ms. Renierson to speak about the regulation of virtual currencies, the application of the money transmission laws, and the many complications that arise from that. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Superintendent Losky and members of the department. My name is Judy Renierson, and I'm a partner at Bryan Cave here in New York City. And I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts on the important issues arising out of the regulation of digital virtual currencies, including Bitcoin. As a lawyer with a practice that focuses on prepaid and emerging payments, I've become very familiar with both state money transmitter licensing laws and anti-money laundering laws and, of course, consumer protection laws. Since I also know and represent a number of Bitcoin companies, I'm particularly pleased to be here today. When I consider the current state of the digital currency industry, and while some of the persons in the last panel, they compared the current state to the beginning of the Internet, I'm reminded of the late 90s when prepaid cards were first being introduced. Back then, some prepaid cards had been linked to criminal activity. I remember a news story branded prepaid cards as candy for criminals, and that the regulatory landscape was described as the Wild West. I think it sounds a little familiar. Well, now prepaid cards are widely regarded as a valuable financial tool relied upon by many Americans for basic financial services. So ingrained are these payment products that recent Affordable Care Act regulations actually require insurance companies to accept prepaid cards for premiums. Well, I believe we're now at a similar juncture for digital currencies, and like prepaid cards, I think digital currencies such as Bitcoin are useful and beneficial products that can become valuable mainstream products and be appropriately regulated. One thing about prepaid card regulation, however, that a lot of people have forgotten, was back in the mid-90s, the Federal Reserve Board actually issued a proposed rulemaking that would have imposed broad restrictions on prepaid cards that were not only very restrictive, but also they were not even technology neutral. The way that the laws were written, it would have encouraged some forms of prepaid, discouraged other forms of prepaid, and actually would have ended up skewing the development of that whole industry. Fortunately, calmer heads prevailed. A study was undertaken, and the decision was made not to commence federal regulation of prepaid cards at that time. So there was actually a little hiatus of time when there was very little federal regulation in the prepaid card world. Instead, the first true regulators in prepaid cards were the states. And in particular, state money transmitter licensing laws were applied. And just as these licensing laws were adapted to prepaid cards, I believe it is feasible to adapt the existing framework to sellers and exchanges of Bitcoin and other virtual currencies. To me, the most urgent need is to have the state ensure that these businesses are owned and operated by persons who understand payments and who are not criminals, terrorists, or fraudsters. And that each business has an effective anti-money laundering compliance program. And it's interesting, just as the people in the last panel talked about how useful it would be to have a safe harbor for startups, I think that's a fabulous idea. I think it's really worth thinking about, as long as we make sure that these entities are not owned by crooks or criminals or fraudsters, have an AML compliance program. And I would also like to add one other thought, which is, if you're going to do that, you don't have to actually limit it just to Bitcoin. There are lots of emerging, very innovative emerging payment companies out there struggling, trying to comply with state money transmitter licensing laws. And while I acknowledge the need for some regulation, I urge that any regulation be done with a light hand, and I'm actually very happy to hear a lot of people here there on the dais saying the same thing, and with a lot of care, not to stifle this important, innovative, and nascent industry. As a final note, I just want to say how grateful I am that the Department has taken the time to seek input before heading down the path of further regulation or legislation. These hearings, I think, are a really good idea and is certainly a step in the right direction. So I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me start with a question for the first two panelists spoke mostly about alternative currencies. We had a question, I don't know if you heard it in the first panel, about ultimately will we have a single currency that survives? Is that sort of where we are inevitably headed? To quote the movie Highlander, there can be only one. I don't know if that's where we're going. I wanted to get your opinions. I'm assuming your opinions are different than that, but I wanted to hear why.
I'll go first. The reason why I created Litecoin is because... Microphone, please. Sorry. The reason why I created Litecoin is because I believe that there will be more than one currency or cryptocurrency that will survive. People like choices, like there's Visa, MasterCard, and American Express. Why does American Express exist, right? There's a network effect where if you have a Visa card, merchants accept Visa, then why would you also have an American Express card and have other merchants accept American Express, right? Similarly, eBay exists where buyers and sellers, there's a network effect where the more buyers are on eBay, the more sellers there will be. But there's also other auctioning sites that have users also. So I think people like choices, and because of that, there's going to be alternative currencies to the main one. So whether or not Bitcoin is the main one, we don't know right now, but there's going to be more than one.
Would you, just to follow up, would you predict that we're going to end up in a credit card type world where we have 3, 4, 5 sort of main cryptocurrencies and then maybe a few others that are far less used, or
yeah,
is
there's
the
going to
jury
be a
out
few
on that?
main ones, probably 2 or 3 that, the main one will be used by everyone. The second one maybe used by like 50% of people. But who knows? I don't know right now. But yeah, there's going to be a few. And then there's going to be a lot little ones that maybe some will fit certain niche communities or certain other groups of people that they might want to use specific currencies.
Ms. Van Cleef?
This is an issue I think that's going to take a number of years to play itself out. If the last time I looked on the capitalization of cryptocurrencies, there were at least 50 different cryptocurrencies that were listed, with it being mathematics-based and with many, many mathematicians in the marketplace. I think we will see many more created as time goes on. I think that it's, in some ways, as someone said to me this week at a Bitcoin conference, the genie is out of the bottle on cryptocurrencies. With respect to other types of currencies, which typically have been associated with gaming. Almost anyone could set up a virtual currency. You could go online today and download the software necessary to create your own virtual currency. Different category from cryptocurrency. And then we've got this other category of the type of currency that I just discussed, which is a commodity-backed type currency. I think that we are probably, as I said, in for a fairly long period of time where we'll be testing these different types of currencies, and it's really going to be a consumer choice at the end of the day. What are the consumers going to choose? Are they going to choose, it's going to be beta versus VHS? Is it going to be PayPal versus using their bank account? it will be the variety of features that the consumers will look at. But I think from a public policy standpoint, your challenge is the fact that there will be always the next innovation coming, and how do you, can you possibly build that into your regulatory framework?
It's a very good point. Did you want to answer the question as well, Ms.
Yeah,
Amigos?
I think I would agree that I think there are openings for multiple successful currencies, and that makes it all the more important to have a very flexible regulatory framework.
On the question of the regulatory framework, in the scheme of cryptocurrency or virtual currency, there are a number of different entities and players. You have the exchanges, you have the wallets, you have the miners, you have individual users. Can you opine on where we should draw the lines in terms of who should get touched by regulation, whether lightly or more heavily, depending on their roles, and if there are people in that chain who maybe should not be bumping into regulators too often? I'm assuming, for example, just individual users.
Yeah, well, I do think that the folks at FinCEN gave us a head start when they started thinking about exchanges, administrators, and users. I know that I mentioned in my testimony, I kind of look at virtual digital cryptocurrencies as something that's sort of under the water. If they're used on the internet for internet things, moving back and forth between other entities that also are issuing or selling cryptocurrencies, I don't see that as the regulated part. I see the risk comes when you get out of the water and you're up there. Once you hit the iceberg sticking out of the water, then it's time, because soon as you can take these currencies and exchange them for a fiat currency, it really increases the risk considerably. So certainly the focus should be on exchanges, and I think that the FinCEN was right on that. But I also think a little bit when you think about the remittance world, when you have someone who holds a wallet and holds the value for purposes of sending it on to someone else, transferring it, I think that's the other category. I think for now, I think I would limit it to those two categories, and I would put a seller of cryptocurrencies into that same category. Someone who's selling them for another currency is really effectively a currency exchange. I do agree. I think someone mentioned it in the last panel as well, that merchants who are accepting bitcoins or similar currencies, I don't think that requires licensing. I would put them in a different category, but I would focus on the exchanges and the remittance companies.
Yeah.
I would offer up, I don't disagree with much of what Judy said. I would look at the kind of role or function that each player is performing and match it up to what the public policy issues are. Are the public policy issues consumer protection? Are they protection from use and abuse for money laundering and other criminal purposes? I think at the end of the day, depending upon what type of regulation or reporting or registration gets put around each one of the players, that I think there needs to be a constant reminder of the obligations that any U.S. person has under the federal criminal statutes, which is not to be involved in the process of moving funds from involved in touching the proceeds of illegal activities, unlawful suspicious activity, and reinforcing that, because I think, as we saw in the case yesterday, you can have someone who is registered, could be someone who is licensed, but if they lose sight of the fundamental criminal statutes that you're just not supposed to be involved in illegal activity, there's nothing you can do as a regulator that will prevent that.
So Bitcoin, Litecoin are peer-to-peer currencies. So I think sending money between two people shouldn't be really regulated. I don't think mining should be regulated, and even if you did regulate it, mining would just move overseas to another country. I think the only place you really need to regulate cryptocurrency is the exchange between cryptocurrency and fiat, and this is where all the money laundering would have to go through. So this is kind of like the bottleneck where all the all the illicit activities will go through. So regulate that, and I think that's going to be enough.
And I'd like to agree with Charles. I didn't mention mining, but unless a miner is actually mining and selling or exchanging, I wouldn't require licensing for mining either, especially people who mine for their own use.
Can I just ask a question on that? Because we did have yes, thank you. Sorry. I'd like to ask a follow-up question on that because we did have an interesting exchange before. Mining strikes me, at least, as a systemic threat rather than a consumer threat or a fraudster threat. And, you know, I think from our perspective, we are concerned about systemic issues as well as how this, you know, individuals interact with the currency. Is that something we should be worried about? Is there a way to get our hands around that threat? Because, you know, maybe there's a back door somewhere in Bitcoin. Maybe there's a way someone can get in and destabilize the system as it exists and as people are depending upon it. So we take it up a level as well, and you know, any insight on that would be tremendously helpful.
So what kind of threat are you thinking about? Can you describe that a little bit more?
On. Or louder. He has it on.
Yeah, what kind of threat are you thinking about?
To tick off a few, perhaps, as we said earlier in the day, some entity or organization would try to corner the market on the currency. You know, the answer we got before was, well, that might take $700 million to do. Well, you know, in the scheme of things, if you have a hostile nation or something of that sort, $700 million is not prohibitive. If you have a situation where someone wants to injure the blockchain, somehow disrupt it, corrupt it, so it would send everybody who's depending upon it into disarray. How is that, one, a significant concern, a realistic one, and two, is that something that a regulator can, in any kind of prophylactic way, try to prohibit?
I actually don't think it's a huge concern that someone will be able to attack the blockchain. I think there are just so many people that are mining all over the world for profit that they're not going to attack the network. And in order for one person or one country to be able to attack the network, it will take a lot of resources, way more than, I mean, obviously, like, some countries actually can attack the network right now, but I think it's going to grow to a point where it won't be able to be attacked. And in terms of regulation, I don't understand why we would need to regulate it, because if, for example, Bitcoin is being attacked and actually someone managed to attack it and destroy it, then another currency that's stronger than Bitcoin will likely replace it. Another currency that is more resistant to a 51% attack, for example, would replace this technology.
I guess it's an immediate concern because there'd be a lot of value in the balance if the system were disrupted, you know, especially if it gets to the point in time that everyone is hoping it will, when it's a global exchange of value and someone to come pull the plug on it. I could see that would have a disruptive effect on economies.
What the U.S. government can do is actually join the network and help protect it.
I recognize that there could be a systemic risk. I don't think this is something that you address with licensing. I mean, this is, and I don't even think we're anywhere close to reaching that point. But I do think that this is something that government is going to want to keep an eye on. And I don't have the answer about how to solve it, because any kind of systemic risk is bigger than all of us here. But I do think that that's a good issue to keep in mind.
I would ask if the risk is really any different than the risk of buying the currency of any particular country that may be subject to an overthrow in the government, a coup, whatever type of a change, where parties would come in and take it over. The other issue is that in many ways you do need to look at this as, depending again what specific type of currency you're looking at. If you're talking about the cryptocurrencies where they are really being used as a substitute for cash, when you have a dollar bill that dollar bill could change, go through 100 different hands before it gets to you. And you may know where you got it from, you would know where you got it from, and maybe the person before you, but you're not going to know probably the other 95 or 6 people in that chain. Does that make it less valid for you to go and put it into your bank account? So it's looking from a regulatory perspective as putting some of the, looking at extending some of the protections and controls that we've put around cash to the cryptocurrencies at the point of entry and exit into the regulated financial systems.
It strikes me, though, that the currency you described to us that is gold-based actually has an answer for it, because you have a single administrator. And that if there were some systemic threat, intervention could be had pretty quickly, pretty promptly, and you could identify the threat and maybe address it. So while you don't know the chain in which the dollar bill got into your hand, you also don't have a system where the Fed can turn off, the spigot and the money just stops all at once. And I guess that's more of a concern that I'm getting at, but I appreciate your responses.
I think that a currency that is centralized actually is a bigger threat than a decentralized currency, because as we've seen in past history, there was currency like Liberty Gold or E-Gold that was centralized, and the owner of the currency was actually doing some kind of money laundering or letting money laundering happen. So whereas a decentralized currency, there's no owner, there's no one that can control it, and no one can actually do illicit activities on it by themselves without being regulated, I guess.
Ms. Ranierson, you talk about in your testimony a little bit about some of the difficulties we face as we think about things like surety bonds, permissible investments, capital levels. Can you, and you talk about sort of with a digital virtual currency world, how do we think about that, especially with all the price fluctuations we see? Yeah. Can you just expand upon that a little bit and sort of give us your best estimate as to how we should deal with it?
Happy to do that, and this is a topic I've been spending a lot of time thinking about. This is hard stuff. I have to admit, the first time I had a client approach me about getting a money transmitter license as a Bitcoin exchange, I just remember thinking, okay, let's just fill out the forms, get a money transmitter license. But then you start thinking about what the repercussions are. I see sort of 4 major purposes of the licensing laws. One is to make sure that the people running it know what they're doing. 2 is to make sure that they're not crooks, criminals, fraudsters. 3 is to make sure that they have the resources, the money, net worth. And then 4th is all these protections built up for consumers. And I think those first 2 issues, making sure they know what they're doing, have the requisite expertise to understand payment laws, to understand what an AML compliance program is all about, and doing that background check is incredibly important. New York is one of the most thorough background checks out there, and it really makes a difference, I think, as a consumer, knowing that you're dealing with a company that's on the up and up. But the other 2, the financial issues, are really difficult. And I have to admit, I've been talking with some other folks about, okay, what do you do on a net worth? If the net worth is entirely in a virtual currency or a cryptocurrency, is that good enough to meet the requirements of the law? I sort of came out, I went back and forth on this. I think basically no, that the net worth requirements have always been placed in U.S. dollars, and you're going to need to have some net worth of U.S. dollars. But I think the department should be open to thinking about crediting at least some of the pool of the cryptocurrency, perhaps looking at the value of it on an average over a period of time to reduce the risk of volatility and so I think that's what you might do for the net worth. When it comes to, and similar for the bonds, I think you're still going to need a bond. The bond's going to have to be in U.S. dollars, at least at this point. I don't think there's any other kind of bonds out there. Again, to come out with the amount of the bond, you're going to have come up with some kind of average over a period of time because of the volatility. And then the third is the permissible investments. And this is the thing that I found one of the most difficult pieces, because that permissible investments out there to cover the outstandings that you as a money transmitter are holding, and that term means, you know, that someone's given you a certain amount of Bitcoin or cryptocurrency of any kind, and you're holding it for a period of time, and you're supposed to always have enough value to cover that that outstanding that you're responsible for, that you've received from the consumer. And if you think about if you try to transfer that value into dollars and then say, well, okay, I'm going to put this many dollars in a bank account to cover it, or this many dollars in, you know, highly rated securities, I think that you're still at risk because the way that these currencies fluctuate. So I have to admit, it took a lot of soul searching, and I'm sure other people have some interesting ideas, but I actually came out saying net worth, bonds, dollars, but when it comes to permissible investments, I think you need to keep those in the currency, the crypto, virtual, digital currency that you've received it in. And then the last point, because if you have a bond that's only based on an average, if you have net worth that's based on an average, you may not have enough in your insurance fund or your bond to cover the risk. And I think the only way that you can therefore license and move this forward is that you're going to have to let the consumer know that there is risk. And I think the consumers can deal with this. I think my experience dealing with payments consumers is that they are really pretty savvy. They read the fine print. They know when it's their hard-earned dollars, they know what they're doing. And I think that if you combine those pieces with some sort of disclosure for consumers that just reminds them, you know, you can't be protected necessarily by the state. You may be protected, but we can't guarantee you that the state will be able to protect these funds. You may lose what you invest in these funds. If you make a purchase with these funds, you know, be aware that it's, you know, irreversible. At least that's the way the Bitcoins are now. And other, you know, there should be a set of disclosures. But I would urge you, from a consumer protection point, not to try to then reshape or come up with a whole new set of consumer rules for these, because you're going to change the essential nature of them. So that's what I ended up coming up with, doing with the funds and having an upfront consumer disclosure that they actually have to click off or something like that. And I think it's workable, I think.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything?
This is a particularly challenging issue, in part because when we talk about currency exchangers and the other players, especially in the Bitcoin ecosphere, the question is, what is it they're doing and what are they handling? So you have entities that are acting as, quote, currency exchangers, but really all they're doing is passing the private key that's necessary for one to take ownership of the Bitcoin, that they're not actually passing the Bitcoin itself to someone. So it's not quite as easy as walking up to the exchange desk at the airport and asking for euros for your dollars. One thought I have had is that you might want to consider having a class of currency exchangers, which is very similar to your sovereign or fiat currency exchangers, and regulating them as you would any currency exchanger. When the currency exchanger moves into the world of offering a wallet, which many of them do to facilitate their customers' ongoing transactions, again, it's going to be, you know, what is it that they are actually holding on to? Are they providing sort of a lockbox for the Bitcoin, for the cryptocurrency, or are they providing the lockbox just for the key? And if it's just the key, can you put a dollar value on that from a minimum net worth perspective, or from a bonding perspective? So I can't profess to have the answers to those questions here, but these are some of the real life issues I see that the industry is trying to work its way through here. Many in the industry are not averse, as I noted in my opening comments, to taking on some element of regulation, but regulation that makes sense given the nature of the business model.
Can I add something?
Please.
So for the cryptocurrency exchange, users would deposit both cryptocurrency and also dollar. So if they deposit dollar and the dollar's in their account, obviously the exchange would need to keep that dollar in the bank and not lend it out or anything like that. And if they deposit cryptocurrency, then the exchange would have to have strict security measures to protect those cryptocurrencies, right? You don't want the exchange to be easily hacked or their user accounts to be easily hacked and have those Bitcoins or Litecoins stolen that way. So if any regulation you're thinking about, it will be regulating to make sure that the exchanges are protecting protecting their users by securing the cryptocurrencies and securing the dollars properly.
Some of the wallets and others out there who sort of hold customer accounts are purchasing insurance. And I'm curious from sort of a regulator perspective, how would that factor, if at all, in your assessment of the net worth, the surety, and some of the permissible investments that you've all talked about?
Sorry. Could you repeat that again? You said some of the wallets have what?
Are thinking to seek to purchase insurance.
Oh, purchase
and,
insurance.
Right, and to sort of cover different losses, whether it be from sort of a cyber attack or taking of the key or whatnot. And I wonder, you talked before about sort of net worth requirements and permissible investments and whatnot. Does that factor in at all?
Yeah. Well, I have seen a lot of sort of interesting innovations when it comes to contracting between parties. And this is not limited to the Bitcoin world. In a previous life, I spent a lot of time dealing with like international currencies. And it's something that contract law has developed over years where they build up protections. Those kinds of insurance provisions, it's not a formal, at least as far as I'm aware, it's not a formal insurance issued by an insurance company, but there's some kinds of guarantee, and you'll see that also in some of the merchant agreements involving Bitcoin as well. And I think that's a way that the market addresses the risk. You've got two parties, and they can contract with each other. They can decide what the risk is, and they can contract it. I think it's a classic thing to do. I think it's a good thing to have.
I fully agree that it's a marketplace solution to the issue, and from a regulator's perspective, it can either be a substitute for, in addition to, some type of a binding requirement if you decide that's an appropriate, something that's appropriately needed.
I wonder if I could just carry that actually back a moment to one of the present particular requirements under our money transmission laws. You know, in the prior panel, we heard from folks who strongly suggested that we use current statutory controls in place and try as best we can to adapt them to cryptocurrencies or other sorts of virtual currencies. In New York, and there is an insurance fund, as you just mentioned. Yep. And I guess on some level, if we're going to be viewing these companies in the context of money transmitters, we have to be careful not to create a disparity. Because if we have a traditional money transmitter who knows how much it must contribute to the fund in order to protect consumers, and we're going to license a virtual or cryptocurrency transmitter under the transmitter laws, how do we make an analog? I mean, how do we span that gap? Because if you're not going to require cryptocurrency transmitters from contributing some value to a fund, you're putting the other folks at a disadvantage. Or are you just going to say users of the cryptocurrency transmission aren't eligible to access the fund in the event that the company goes down, bankrupt, and leaves a whole bunch of consumers in the lurch? How do we mesh those two worlds together? Because there's been a great deal of thought on how to protect the consumer through a market effort.
I think the most important element there is deciding what you are protecting. What value is it that you're protecting? And I think once you understand what the value is that you're protecting, then figuring out the amount becomes an easy proposition.
Well, I want to send $100 to my long-lost cousin in Slovakia, and I decide I don't want to use Western Union. I want to do it in Bitcoin. And so I go to an exchange, some entity that can exchange it to Bitcoin. Now, whether they're just transmitting a key, regardless, I plop down $100 $100, and in the midst of it all, crypto transmission co. goes down. Now my $100 is gone. How, under ordinary the ordinary framework for consumer protection, New York has this fund that you can make a claim upon, and the other money transmitters have to contribute to this fund to help out all persons who have been injured by the failure of another money transmitter. I've lost $100 in value. Can I, as a consumer, go to the New York fund? Does Crypto Express have to pay into the fund in dollars? I mean, these are the very practical things that we're trying to get our arms around if we're going to create some framework along the pattern of money transmission.
Well, I have to admit that my starting out thought was that no, that fund is just not used because the currencies are too volatile, and that there are lots of other things that the cryptocurrency exchanges can be investing in and need to invest in, and trying to set up this insurance pool to cover consumers who are investing in a fairly volatile product. I guess I don't see that is the role of the state and of the currency fund. But I hadn't thought of your thought about is that a level playing field, and maybe there's maybe there's another place for them to provide some kinds of protections, but I don't really think that makes sense, at least right now. And maybe this is something, everyone said last panel, and I think I agree, that the more liquidity, the more places accept it, the less volatile. And we may just be talking about, okay, it's January 2014, and it could be a year from now. Maybe the fluctuations won't be nearly so bad, and may be bad with some currencies and not others, and maybe there's a yardstick that you can measure it. But I think that this is really, again, this is hard stuff. This is very difficult. But my gut tells me that we got to save that insurance fund for other consumers, and at this point treat the virtual currencies differently.
So I'm obviously not an expert at this, but common sense tells me that if a company is dealing with more dollars a day, then they pour more money into the fund. Is that correct?
There's a certain formula by which each company, and there's a cap actually that's set by statute that each company has to contribute into a fund, and that obligation to contribute is triggered oftentimes by the failure of a colleague in the industry, a money transmitter. So it's a little complicated, it's a little situationally specific. It doesn't necessarily go along the lines you've described.
So I don't see why a Bitcoin exchange can't fall under the same guidelines. If they deal with a lot of dollars, it doesn't matter what the Bitcoin value is, right? In the end, all you care about is reimbursing that dollar amount if the customer loses that dollar amount. So if an exchange deals with $1 million a day, then they would pour more money into that fund. So the same can apply to these exchanges, right? In the end, it's just dollar.
So you don't think there's a problem about, you don't think there's an apples to apples problem, or that with the volatility of the coin, if they collect net value in dollars every year of $1 million, let's say, they, no matter what the Bitcoin may fluctuate over time, it could end up, the million in cash could end up being worth at the end of the year $25 in exchange. It wouldn't matter. In your mind, you think it'd be right to just use the actual cash as the measure of
Well, I mean,
contribution.
If they're holding $1 million in Bitcoins for the user today, you have a certain amount they contribute to the fund. If next year Bitcoin goes up 10 times, now they're holding $10 million, they contribute more, right? It's as if the company is doing more business.
The worry for me is it's not the account full of dollars that they're holding, it's the account full of whatever the crypto digital currency is. And so maybe you've put in 100 of your hard-earned Bitcoins, which today is worth an awful lot of money, but you don't know. And if the company goes out of business and they've been holding on to this for 6 months or a year, what do you get back from the assurance fund? Do you get the value that when it went higher? Do you get what you put in? What if it's not worth anything anymore? So that's the difficulty with volatile currencies in this one space. I agree that to the extent that you're holding dollars, and that almost is classic money transmission without worrying about the virtual digital currencies, but it's this pool of other currencies, which is really it's a difficult problem.
If I might offer, I think this goes back to deconstructing what the model is. So if someone walks into a Bitcoin currency exchange or a crypto express, as you would say, and hands over $100, do they get back immediately the equivalent in Bitcoin that they would then send on to their relative? In that case, that's a pure currency exchange function, and there is no holding of value. Now, if I decide to give $100 to Cryptocurrency Express and have that sit at Cryptocurrency Express until I'm ready to do the next transaction, then yes, cryptocurrency is holding my $100, and that's going to be valued as any $100 would be valued, at least in relative to other currencies. If I decide to go ahead and buy the Bitcoin and have it held at Cryptocurrency Express for some other function, I think the critical issue there is making sure that the consumer understands the currency exchange risk, as it would with whether it made the decision to hold it in Bitcoin or in euro or the yen. It would be the same issue in whatever the currency might be.
The question's for Mr. Lee. You created Litecoin presumably because you saw a need. I'm wondering what were your motivating factors, and do the folks that are now developing other virtual currencies share some of those same concerns? Have they identified some of those same needs?
So when I created Litecoin in late 2011, one of the main reasons why I created it, there were actually other alternatives before Litecoin, and those alternatives were created by other people. And one of the characteristics that was shared by the creators were that they seemed a bit greedy. They something called pre-mine, so they mined a lot of coins for themselves before they launched it. And people didn't like that because people didn't like to support a coin that makes someone else rich. So I saw the need, a market desire for a coin that was very fair. And I also noticed that people do like choices, right? They like supporting an alternative currency. So that's why I created silver to Bitcoin's gold. So I created Litecoin, and one other thing about Litecoin is it has faster transactions, and it makes transacting Litecoin seem a bit easier. So there was market demand for that, so I filled it.
When you say you created it, I just want to understand that more, and I mean this in all seriousness, because I don't know that I fully can get my mind around it. Tell us a little bit more about what that means, and if you could just speak up a little. I can tell from reactions in the back, people are having trouble hearing you.
Sure. So Bitcoin is basically just source code, right? People run this source code all over the world. Their nodes talk to each other, confirming transactions, sending transactions to each other, and building on top of the blockchain, which is a decentralized ledger for Bitcoin, right? So by creating Litecoin, all I did was took the Bitcoin source code, which is open source, so anyone can play around with it. I modified a few things about it, and I launched it. So basically, it's just like I launched it out there, and then people saw the value of it, and they started mining it, and started running the client, and started supporting it. So
does it run? Sorry to interrupt. Does it run similarly to Bitcoin in terms of it's got a ledger?
Yeah,
you have
it's
people
very
mining
similar to
it. They're
Bitcoin.
adding to the chain.
Yeah. Most of it is almost exactly like Bitcoin, except for it's faster, has a bit more coins, and it's a totally different ledger. So it's actually very easy to create alternative currencies. And recently there's been a huge amount of alternative currencies being created. Most of them, well, half of them are created by similar people who are greedy, who wanted to strike it rich. And half of them are kind of serious.
How is the Litecoin system ledger different from the Bitcoin?
The difference is blocks happen 4 times faster.
Okay.
So every 2.5 minutes, on average, you get one more block onto the ledger. And a block contains a bunch of transactions that happen between the last block.
Has the mining for Litecoin become as sort of laborious or require the amount of computing hardware that Bitcoin has now, or is it sort of running behind?
It's hard to say. It's hard to compare. So Bitcoin mining is dominated by what they call ASICs hardware right now, and Litecoin mining is mostly GPU mining. So people running their GPU cards mining Litecoin. So people are not using the same hardware to mine both coins. So I guess it's kind of hard to compare what's harder. You can possibly compare how much money it takes that's being spent to mine.
Right.
And I've actually haven't done that number calculation to compare the Bitcoin cost versus Litecoin, but I would assume Bitcoin cost is a bit higher than Litecoin cost.
And do you, in your altering of the Bitcoin code, did you place a limit on the number of Litecoins that are ultimately going to be mined, or is that?
Yeah, so the growth rate for Litecoin is similar to Bitcoin. And the limit is 4 times more coins. So there's 84 million total Litecoins at the end versus 21 total Bitcoins.
Can you, since we have you on that issue, I mean, can you talk a little bit about it's something we didn't get to in the first panel, but the notion of having a limit ultimately on the amount has all kinds of interesting and potentially problematic or potentially not impacts on the currency over time. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So Satoshi Nakamoto, when he designed the coin, I believe he modeled it after gold. So a lot of the terms are similar to gold, where there's like mining, there's production, and then so he wanted a coin that kind of plateaus after a certain amount, right? So gold is similar. There's only a fixed amount of gold on Earth, and it costs more and more to dig gold out of the ground as gold becomes less scarcer, right? So similarly, Bitcoin and Litecoin, there's a fixed amount, and it gets harder and harder to actually mine those Bitcoins and Litecoins. And in the end, it would plateau towards a specific number. And for Bitcoin, it's 21 million.
Can I ask you, recently there has been some reporting in the press about how many natural resources are required to mine. Is Litecoin a greener cryptocurrency? I mean, is there a way to regulate that? Because we understand that some miners, I think, are migrating to northern climes because they can use geothermal energy, which is cheaper. Is it, in all seriousness, is this something that ought to be considered either as a financial factor or as a broader environmental factor?
It is true that it costs a lot of energy to mine a Bitcoin or a Litecoin. And some people tend to think that the energy is not actually wasted because it's really used to secure the blockchain, right? It's actually doing something very useful. It's providing a lot of value to have a decentralized blockchain that would record everyone's transactions and prevent anyone from undoing those transactions.
I'm not suggesting any judgment on it, except to say that the folks have reported that it leaves a very large carbon footprint. It burns a lot. So is there a way to control that, I guess, is really more my question. As technology evolves, is there a way to limit the need for such a vast amount of electricity to run the mining operations?
With Bitcoin, there isn't. There is some alternative currencies have been experimenting with different ways, different mining algorithms. So some of them are trying to find algorithms that are actually useful, right? Some people are trying to see if we can have mining actually cure cancer, for example. So if you can actually have mining that actually does real work, does protein folding or something similar that's useful to society, then that would be better. So people are constantly researching, thinking of new ways to make cryptocurrency more green, so to speak.
Thank you.
You're now making my head explode. I want you I'm going to cure cancer and mine coins. It's a little beyond me. But God bless. More questions?
Has mining for Litecoin moved out of the hobbyist phase? I mean, is it possible for someone to still sit there with an ordinary computer in their home and mine Litecoin?
Yes, you can still do that with Litecoin.
And I guess my other question is, you had mentioned earlier that there are going to be, you could envision 3 or 4 successful cryptocurrencies coming to the fore. Do you think that Bitcoin will be sort of a first among equals in that? And what are going to be some of the characteristics of those successful coins?
I guess it's hard for me to predict right now. In the end, the market will decide what currency provides enough value to be useful for people to support. Right. Currently, Bitcoin is the main one. I mean, as the first one, it added tremendous value. Basically, it's something that's totally new, and a lot of people support it. In the future, I can't say. Right.
Can I add something, though? I do think a huge piece of how successful any crypto digital virtual currency will be is where it is used. And if you make one that's extraordinarily easy for merchants to accept and make it valuable to merchants, reduce the risk of chargeback, those kinds of things, that's, in my view, is going to be more likely to be a successful currency. That's a huge piece of it.
Sort of a separate question, and I probably should have asked it to the first panel, but I didn't get a chance to. One thing I've struggled with is understanding what it means to say that virtual currency is a programmable currency. What's one of the positives people mention for the future of digital currency is it's programmable. Can any of you expand on exactly, well, I know it when I read it, I can read the words, but I'm not sure I'm grasping the advantages that brings. And maybe we should start with you, Mr. Lee. Since you look most confident as I say this.
So Bitcoin is actually built, it's more complicated than just a currency. So currency is actually just one function of the blockchain that can be, that's useful. So it uses script, which is like a programming language where you can actually do more than one thing, right? So confirming that party A sent coins to party B is just one thing. Other things that can be built on top of the blockchain are you can have Bitcoin confirm, like one Bitcoin represent stocks, right? You can have like 1/1000th of a Bitcoin represent one Google stock, for example. And then if I send that 1/1000th of a Bitcoin to someone else, in addition to sending that Bitcoin, the stock is also tied to it. And whoever owns that 1/1000th of a Bitcoin actually owns that stock. So you can have Bitcoin represents, this is something called colored coins. You can have Bitcoin represent anything, right?
Called
colored coins.
Colored coins.
It's the fact that you can color a coin to represent something else. So you can color a set of coins to represent deeds, for example, deeds of houses or cars or anything that you can think of.
But you're actually sending the deed. You're not
No,
just
you're
coloring
actually-
it and saying.
No, you're representing that deed with that one coin. So if you send that coin to someone else, you're basically transferring that deed to that person. So if that person comes to the government and says, I actually own this piece of land because this coin belongs to me, they show you, they can prove that the coin belongs to them and they actually own that piece of land. So stuff like that. And then there's just a lot of things you can build on top of Bitcoin that people have not even thought of right now.
That ain't money transmission. I wonder if I could just follow up with a question that's more regulatory in focus, and it may sound like a game of semantics, but it's really not. Mr. Lee, you've talked about Litecoin being the silver to Bitcoin's gold, okay? And, you know, poetically speaking, that smacks of being a sort of commodity. And it's a real important question for us. What are we dealing with? I mean, people call it cryptocurrency. Is this really some kind of digital commodity? The reason I'm questioning is not just, as I said, a game of semantics. It may define, and other countries are doing this, how we slot this phenomenon, this economic phenomenon, and how we regulate it. So in your view, being in the business for a while and looking at all sorts of different things, how would you define it? If you had to put a rectangular peg in a square hole, something sort of like it, what would be the best description?
I believe it has multiple definitions, and it depends on how it's being used. It's what is its function. If it's being used as a medium of exchange for value, it is a currency. If it is being used in the other ways that Mr. Lee just defined, it's not. It may be a commodity. It may be an asset of some other type. So I think that, again, is a challenge when especially you're dealing in the cryptocurrency world, because there are multiple functions for this thing that is called a Bitcoin or a Litecoin or some other type of cryptocurrency.
I have to admit, I have been looking at the commodities issues and looking at the commodities laws, and that would be a complete game changer. If these were suddenly designated as commodities, it would change who your regulator is. It would move. It would be a huge change. And I've talked to clients who kind of wish that it was a commodity, because they think at least they'll only have one regulator instead of 50 separate regulators. But I've talked to commodity lawyers, and I'm definitely not a commodity lawyer, who have basically said, oh, I don't know, because of this, does it fit, does this not fit? I know that I've heard unofficially that the CFTC is, been looking at this. And just like you're looking at this, everyone is trying to figure it out. I basically went on faith once FinCEN decided it was money transmission. It was a federal regulator, came out, stuck their necks out and said, okay, this is what we've decided it is. You're a money services business. This is money transmission. And at least that gave us, some, stake in the ground that we could hold on to. Otherwise, as people would talk about, nailing jello to the wall, it just felt so amorphous. So I'm comfortable with that, money transmission, but I agree with Carol and Charles that depending on what the function is, it may not always fit in that. When you're using these products to as a payment mechanism to move money from one person to another person, I'm very comfortable with the FinCEN's determination and the money transmission. But whether it always fits, that's a difficult question. I mean, this is the first time I'd ever heard about the colored coins moving deeds and things. So I was like, whoa, that's a different world.
So I think that cryptocurrency it's not really commodity, it's not really currency, it's not really asset, it's kind of all the above. So I think we have to come up with a new term for it. In the end, cryptocurrency is actually just ownership. You can just prove that you own a piece of those coins, and when you send Bitcoins to another person, you're actually just transferring that ownership of that coin to the other person. So it could be the coin could represent anything. Right now, people use it to represent money. Right, Bitcoin is valuable. You can represent, like I said, you can represent deed. You can represent anything you want. So in the end, it's ownership.
Thank you.
Actually, can you just explain to me how do you prove ownership in all those different scenarios?
So cryptocurrency is it uses cryptography to for each Bitcoin, let's say you own, you have the private key to the Bitcoin, and the Bitcoin has a public address. You have an address that can hold Bitcoins, right? You have a public address and a private key. The fact that you have the private key and no one else does means you're the only person that can actually transmit those Bitcoins to someone else. So that's ownership. When you have the key and no one else has, then you own those coins. But in the end, if you give your key to other people, then they all kind of can control it, so you no longer own it. Right? Does that answer?
I was going to go there. If you assign your key, give your private key to someone else, how does that affect? And you're saying then there's a group who owns it?
Kind of, yeah.
Collective ownership?
Yeah. I mean, or you could actually forget your private key or lose it. Then all of a sudden, those Bitcoins are lost because no one could actually send them anymore. They're still there on the blockchain, right? You can still, it's still there, but because no one actually remember and know the private key anymore, it can't be sent. So in a sense, no one actually owns them anymore.
Do you get locked out of your house?
Kind of, but it's like forever.
Can you, and I don't know if all of you or lawyers up there, can you talk more, it's less an issue for us, but I think it's something that's important about the potential tax issues that we're going to have to face, or the IRS is going to have to face down the road, and what you foresee there, problems, issues, et cetera?
Well, I know that the IRS is looking at this right now. There have been a number of reports about it, and I know that they're struggling with how to categorize it, and it's really important because of the investment, what that investment gain, how it's going to be taxed, and that all comes down to how you categorize these products. And that's about all I really know. I have a tax partner who has been helping me on this, and if I'd known you were asking that question, I would have told him to come along. I'm happy to provide you a separate note from him, because it's a difficult issue.
Again, I'm not a tax lawyer as well, but certainly the valuation issues, do you take it with is it an investment or is it currency? But even if you have currency, sometimes you'll take it with a stepped up rate. There's also an issue as to whether FACTA may be involved here as well when you start talking about accounts that are being held on the books of exchangers elsewhere around the world. I think that we will probably have a few more tax issues that will come up before we're done in this area.
That's right.
In terms of taxing gains on cryptocurrency, it's kind of similar to stock, right? Your stockbroker will tell the IRS when you sell a stock or when you buy a stock, and you would actually have to also self-report and tell IRS how much you paid for the stock and how much you sold it and how much you made off of it. Similarly, Bitcoin exchanges likely will have to tell the IRS when someone sells or buys Bitcoin or Litecoin or whatnot, and then it's up to the person to also self-report their gains on it. So I don't really see that there's going to be much problem with respect to this new technology.
I want to just go back to sort of some of the requirements around licensing some of these sort of money transmitters. We do examinations of our sort of money transmitters, or licensed money transmitters. And I guess I would sort of put out to all of you, do you think that there are sort of certain requirements or anything that should be specifically tailored during our examination process for virtual currency, for entities that are engaging in virtual currency?
I did address this briefly. It does seem to me that a lot of those requirements are very similar. 2 to 4 months before the exam, you send a list of documents you want. You're going to want to look at transaction records. You're going to want to look at financial records. You're going to want to look at litigation and complaints. You're going to send in your examiners who are going to kick the tires. One of the questions that I had was how many of these operations, especially the exchanges, have full customer service setups and things like that, or how many of those do these things offshore. But they're still, no matter where these functions occur, if you're based and you're licensed in in any state, then one of the things that a state always requires is, I don't care what kind of money transmitter you are, you better have, if you're under exam, you have to have a place in the United States where the records will be, where you can send your people to review it. And I guess I see that process would be followed with a Bitcoin exchange. One of the things that I'm not sure about, and this is because I'm not as much of an operational person, is how the reviewing things like testing transactions and monitoring transactions, how that would work. I've been told that there are comparable ways that you can look at. I mean, certainly we all know that you can follow every Bitcoin, on the public ledger so that you can see those things. But when you're talking a particular exam for a particular exchange, what records they keep, I think that you're in a little bit of a new world when it comes to that, and I think they're going to be looking to you to say, okay, what records do you want us to keep? And you're going to have to, and again, trying to do this with a light hand, trying not to make it so voluminous and burdensome that no one can possibly comply with it without investing gazillions of dollars would be nice. But I think that from what I understand, again, talking to my clients, is that they think this is doable. If you send them a list of records, they will make sure they're available.
It will be incumbent upon the examiner to understand the business model that they are looking at, and to walk in and think that every exchanger is going to look the same, or in the case of the central administrator, that one central administrator is going to look the same as the next. There will be definitely a learning curve in understanding the particular model and the type of issues that the examiner will need to focus on. In terms of the books and records, I think the advantage is that these are all being built off of highly sophisticated technology platforms, and so the ability to keep, to store, and retrieve records should be probably much easier than in sort of the old-fashioned traditional money transmitter setting, especially where you have multiple agents that you're dealing with. It will tend to be more of a centralized examination, because you won't have, you typically won't have the agent networks to deal with. On the other hand, to the extent you've got a central administrator, you may have issues that come up with having multiple exchanges off of that one system. So there will be a number of issues that will have to be wrestled with and understood appropriately in going into these examinations, but I don't see there being any particular problems sitting out there in understanding them. You may have valuation issues like we talked about earlier. What are the balance sheets going to look like? That type of thing. These are the issues that I know people who are in the process we're working with to file applications and get and have approvals. That these are the real world issues that we're now facing.
I'd like to add one other thing, though. It's important. I mean, the industry, when prepaid cards first came out, when mobile payments came out, the industry has always been happy to do training with examiners through the CSBS, through FFIEC, and I'm sure I can speak for the industry that we would be happy to help if there is training that needs to be done for examiners, that we can help, because it's going to be, as Carol rightly said, it's going to be a learning curve.
A certain sector of the traditional money transmitter industry is bricks and mortar, and there are all the paper messages that go with the transfer and all. To what extent do you think the companies that you're representing now are going to be accessible to the under or non-banked population? People go and get transfer money, send MoneyGrams, what have you, on the corner. Strikes me that Bitcoin on the one hand could provide an online service, but then again, what percentage of the population that is underbanked has access to online services? So is this, or the phone, that strikes me too. So that's what I was curious. What is, to the extent you can share, what is the business plan, the notions? Is it a demographic that these companies are targeting as a potential business source?
I don't think they're actually being targeted at this point, but as a lawyer that works with the unbanked all the time, because really that's a big focus of the prepaid industry, I think that there is a huge opportunity because of the lower costs. As long as the products can be, you're not going to have people who are going to have sophisticated laptops, but a lot of them will have smartphones, and I think that is certainly already a fact of life for a lot of these virtual currencies. So I think this is, one of those silver linings that we have to look for. I think it's a real opportunity. And it's another reason that I think it's important that we do this hard work to come up with a regulatory framework that works, because I really think it will be very, very helpful for the underbanked. Just talking about, as we did before, about the cost of sending remittances home, things like that. Oh, it would be terrific.
I think it's important to keep in mind that we're very early in this whole phenomena of the cryptocurrencies, and this is an incredible build out of the infrastructure that is underway right now. And even observing what's happened in the last 6 or 8 months, it's like light years in terms of development. We're seeing all sorts of tools, apparatus that are coming into the marketplace that are going to help reach out to a variety of segments of the economy. So that the latest is certainly the ATM machine. So you know, you don't need a bank and a bank account, but you can walk up to an ATM machine and put your cash in and get your Bitcoin. And again, as Judy said, if you've got that cell phone, if you've got some channel device to the internet that you can then access your account and manage your account, you're good to go in conducting a transaction. So I think it's more the limitation of the channel device, the channel of the mobile phone or the computer that's going to be more limiting than anything to the underbanked and unbanked.
I think that Bitcoin is really a revolution. It can really help the underbanked. So Bitcoin is a new form of currency where you actually, it's push, right? The traditional form of payment is you use a credit card. It's kind of a pull payment where you swipe your card, the merchant has your card information, then they just pull however much they want from your credit card. And with Bitcoin, you actually have to authorize. You have to authorize exactly how much you want to send to who, right? So being push, there's actually a lot of interesting kind of ways people can receive money that you couldn't previously before. For example, recently a college kid held up the QR code. He was at a sports event. They were filming. He held up his QR code so the camera can see. And then people saw that QR code is actually a Bitcoin address, and a lot of people just sent him tips just because he was, just for the heck of it. And all of a sudden he got like thousands and thousands of dollars of real money just because he was able to show people, this is how you pay me. And this is not something that can be done traditionally. One other example is, like the ATM example, right? You can go to a Bitcoin ATM, put in some cash and get some Bitcoins. Or you can think of a, let's say a soda vending machine. Right? Instead of swiping your card, it shows your QR code that you send Bitcoins to. You can use your phone, type in or scan the QR code, send money, send Bitcoins to the address, and out comes your soda. But what if you don't have Bitcoin on you, right? You can send an email. You send that QR code, you send that address to your mom and say, I ran out of cash. Can you pay for the soda for me? Your mom gets the email, sends Bitcoins to that address, and then your soda comes out. Right. This is not something
Can Mom be sure what you spent that on?
Well, she's just sending
Goes to the
like
soda machine.
$1 worth of coins, right? So in some sense, she shouldn't care. But yeah, so this kind of payment is not possible. You can't really ask someone to pay for your soda.
Right. And I'm assuming all the sort of examples that you just gave, you can do that with Litecoin too.
Exactly.
Okay.
And also because you don't have to, with credit cards, you have to give out your billing address, right? There's a lot of fraud reasons why you have to give out your billing address. They have to know where you live, your information, so that if you actually try to defraud them, they can get back the money. But with Bitcoin, Litecoin, cryptocurrency payments, once you send the coins, you can't charge it back. So the person receiving the coins are not worried of chargebacks, so they can give you the product right away and without having to ask you for your personal information.
I might note, though, to the extent that the underbanked or unbanked have issues and are underbanked or unbanked because of customer identification issues, presumably as we move forward and the customer identification protocol is fully accepted within the digital and virtual currency world, those same issues are going to exist there, too.
That's a smart point.
not that you may have a sense of this yet, but with all the wonderful things you just described, are you aware whether vendor financing has really come to this world yet, and whether you're finding, a kind of partnership growing between tech companies directly with service providers?
My sense is that there is. I can't give you any definite examples. I was talking to a consultant who was extolling the virtues of micro currency uses and transactions, and he was clearly working with some companies investigating ways that they could very quickly and easily move, I think this was Bitcoin payments, and in the very, like tolls, things like that. So there are opportunities. There is a lot of energy right now on the investment side and then the innovation side of these digital currencies. It's really, it's pretty breathtaking, actually.
Currently, there's a lot of investment into like the Bitcoin ATMs or the exchanges, basically ways for people to actually acquire these Bitcoins, right, other than mining for them. So once people are able to get these Bitcoins, then they would want to spend them. And recently, like Overstock announced that they're supporting Bitcoin. They're going to accept Bitcoin for everything on their site. Tiger Direct is also doing that. You'll see more and more merchants starting to accept Bitcoins. And it's a kind of a network effect. People are able to get Bitcoins, people can spend Bitcoins, and merchants have low fees, no risk of chargebacks, and it's basically a win-win for everyone.
The reason I ask is this morning we heard from some angel investors who have been collecting trusts, and we talked, creating trusts, and we talk about how they're saving or hoarding coins, and that creates a kind of weird dynamic in terms of promoting the expansion of Bitcoin as a usable object in some sense. I guess it was late 90s when we saw the grand expansion of wireless telephony. A lot of that was built out by vendors. It wasn't built out necessarily by these types of investors, and it just strikes me that kind of participation is much more conducive and promotive of spreading the use of Bitcoin more broadly than those who might, speculate on its temporary value when it's saved. I'm just curious whether that's taken off and is a reality.
We've come a long way in a year. A year ago, you'd find very few people who knew what Bitcoin was. Today, the knowledge in the population as a whole is significantly higher. I think that Mr. Lee's comment was absolutely right, that as people become more aware of it, there's going to be more demand for its use, and people will be thinking about how they can use it. I've been attending regularly Bitcoin conferences over the last year, and to see the differences in a 6 or 8 week time period from one conference to the next, and the new uses that are new applications that are being developed for it, for whether it's Bitcoin or it's another cryptocurrency. There is, as Judy said, a tremendous amount of innovation that's happening in the marketplace to build out this larger structure that's going to be necessary to support this new type of currency. And again, whether it's a cryptocurrency or it's a digital currency, whatever type it is, there are just amazing developments that are going on at the moment, and I think we just will continue to see that at an ever-growing rate. It is very exciting to see how all of this is happening.
I'm curious about how the gold-backed currency that you discussed earlier, how the record of the transactions is maintained, because with Bitcoin and Litecoin, there's a blockchain, the miners maintain it, and the miners' motivation is that they get coin out of it. So what's the motivation of the administrator to maintain that system, and what happens if they just stop maintaining it?
The central administrator, the system is governed by a body of rules that have been developed much along the lines of contract law. but the rules are set out, and in fact, many different elements have been built into it. So, for example, if the administrator, for whatever reason, is not going to go forward with the system, there is a way to unwind the system, and that's provided in this rules-based system. In terms of maintaining the books and records, this is an essential element of the operation of the system, is to be able to track, who is coming into the system, who's setting up the accounts, and then being able to manage the transactional activity, the movement of the currency from one account to the other. It will be in the system, and I think presumably those records will be kept for possibly ever for the existence of the system. And we'd be happy to provide you with more information on that. It's rather detailed and can show you the work papers and so on surrounding that.
Okay. Well, we only have 3 panelists for this panel, so it went a little faster than the last one. Thank you all very much for some very insightful, smart, interesting testimony. Tomorrow we have 3 more panels. We're going to start the morning off at 10 a.m. with a law enforcement panel. We'll have Cy Vance, the Manhattan DA, here. We'll also have the number 2 from the Southern District of New York, a guy named Rich Zabel, who's a fantastic lawyer and prosecutor. We're then going to have a panel of merchants primarily, including Overstock.com will be here. We'll hear from them. And then lastly, we're going to end with a very scintillating academic panel, which we'll get into a lot of very interesting, maybe big picture issues about the past, present, and future of virtual currencies. So again, thank you all for taking the time today. Those of you who are coming back tomorrow, we look forward to seeing you. And thanks again to our panelists who spent a lot of time testifying and preparing. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.